We are absolutely thrilled to be at JW3, and we think it's highly symbolic that we are holding this event in this building. It's really a symbol of a bridge between two communities, Ukrainian and Jewish community now in London, and I think more broadly wherever they live, that these two communities try to talk to each other and to try to understand their past and many centuries of shared history on those lands, which is now Ukraine. The lands which were contested for many centuries and belonged to many different empires, and people living there were subjected to different colonization policies, and neither Ukrainians nor Jews haven't had their state for a very long time. So there are lots of commonalities, but there are lots of differences as well. And for many centuries, these communities lived in a quite insulated kind of way. And even though there were some interactions and exchanges, there were also a sense of separation, of running parallel lives, if you wish. Ukraine used traditionally to be home to a huge Jewish community. I think there's nothing new about that. Jews lived in big cities, in small cities, towns, in villages, in shtetls, and they had a very significant cultural presence as well. Of course, during the Holocaust, most of them perished, and for many decades after that, the memory of Holocaust was cast into oblivion. And things started changing relatively recently, about 5 years ago, when Ukraine experienced dramatic transformation of its identity. A revolution of dignity took place in Ukraine 5 years ago in Kyiv, its capital. Ukraine lost Crimea. Now in the east of Ukraine there's war happening. So all these things really triggered a massive search for identity, which is still ongoing in Ukraine. And now an opening appeared, and it turned out that there's a huge interest towards other non-Ukrainian people who lived on Ukrainian soil, their history, and the marks they left on our history. And we see this in many different ways. And one of them is a transformation that takes place in Ukrainian cities and villages. And today we have two amazing speakers from Ukraine, and they are both from Lviv, which is the capital of Galicia, of a region in western Ukraine that is often referred to as Galicia. And one of them is born to a Lvivian, by origin, is Iryna Starovoyt. Yes. And for Marla, Lviv became an adopted home. So these are two very different stories, and I think we are really ideally positioned to look what's happening in Lviv, but more broadly in Ukraine, in terms of coming back to the Jewish roots and rediscovering Jewish identity, and how two communities actually interact, or maybe do not interact in some instances, in trying to make it happen. Just a couple of words about our speakers. Iryna Starovoyt is an associate professor of Cultural Studies Department at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. And in fact, Ukrainian Institute London, even though we are a London-based charity, we are affiliated with this university. Iryna is a scholar, and she's a researcher as well, and apart from Ukraine, she also teaches in many other European universities, and she is also an accomplished poet. She published 3 collections of poetry in Ukraine. She's also a public intellectual, and she speaks very often on the issues of identity and remembrance. And Marla Osborn, she was born in California, and she had a career as an attorney. And she came to Ukraine, how many years ago?
10 years ago.
10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that you've been involved with a number of charities across Ukraine and Poland to safeguard Jewish cultural heritage. Now Marla is the Chief Executive Officer of a non-profit NGO in Ukraine, which is called Roharyn Jewish Heritage. And Roharyn is a small Galician town where her grandma is from. So there's a really close connection there. And I actually met Marla through Facebook. So we became Facebook friends first before we met in person. And I became really excited about the work that she does. I think it's really amazing. And I'm really excited that we got a chance to bring these two speakers over to London and to let them share their experiences with us. So I would like to pass the floor to Marla, probably first, and then to Iryna. Yes, and then we'll have time for questions.
Okay. Yeah, the questions I think are going to be, for me, the most important and interesting part. I'm going to, first, thank you for inviting me and being on the radar. I'm going to speak a little bit first about my project in Roharyn, but then I want to shine a light on non-Jewish Ukrainians that are managing, initiating, and sustaining projects of Jewish heritage largely off the radar of Jewish descendants. And I'm going to do something a little unusual, which is actually to read a little something, because it turns out, opening quote is from my co-panelist, Iryna. I keep it in my wallet, actually, as inspiration. She says, cities live longer than the language and traditions of their founders. As residents, we inherit more than one history. We are heirs to the entire changes of local residents, conflicting memories and landscapes of violence and guilt. The addresses that had become the last places for some, the communities that no longer exist, the former residents exterminated. The landscapes of trauma are an open wound. Iryna spoke these words at a lecture in summer 2016 at the Lviv Center for Urban History. We have the founder here tonight, which I'm thrilled about. And Iryna noted at that time that from 1941 to 43, nearly every city in Ukraine faced persecutions and mass killings of Jews. With Ukrainian independence, as Marina just spoke about, the long silence under Soviet Ukraine, the inability to openly speak about, explore, analyze this violent past that erased Jewish presence from the landscape is finally slowly coming to an end. I have slides, and I'm going to start on this one as I give you a background of Roharyn. So for the last 7 years, my husband Jay and I have been working to rebuild Jewish memory in Roharyn. It's about an hour and 15-minute drive southwest of Lviv. It's in the Ivano-Frankivsk Oblast, but it's almost at the juncture of Lviv Oblast, Ternopil, and Ivano-Frankivsk. And as Marina mentioned, my paternal grandmother was born there. I made my first trip there 10 years ago. And it's very, very typical of Western Ukraine and historic Eastern Galicia in that 80 years ago it had a very vibrant Jewish community. That community was over 350 years old. At its peak, it represented more than 50% of the population and 99% of the businesses on the Rynek. And it was interwoven with various ethnicities, but predominantly Ukrainian. The Polish component was quite small in Roharyn, which is a little unusual for Eastern Galicia, but it was about 40% Jewish, 40% Ukrainian, and 20% Polish. And over the span of less than 10 years, both the Jewish community and the Polish community were eliminated, the Jews by execution and the Poles by forced relocation. So if you go to Roharyn today, it is a 100% Ukrainian city. It has about 8,000 people, which is about the same population it had before the war. The Polish school buildings still exist, and you can still see Piotr Skarga as a faint ghost sign on there, but it's a Ukrainian school. The businesses are Ukrainian, and the only language you hear on the streets is Ukrainian. there are no Jews and there are no Poles, and there are very, very few people in Roharyn today that are even aware that Jews and Poles once lived there, and not just lived there for a short period of time, but for a long time. There are 2 Jewish cemeteries in Roharyn, and is typical for Eastern Galicia. They were destroyed during the war. The headstones as part of the execution of the people. There's also the erasure of the culture, and it was very common for the cemeteries in Eastern Galicia to have had the headstones pillaged and reused as paving and building materials. We have a part of town that's today surrounded by private apartment buildings, but it's documented that Gestapo had headquarters there, and the entire area needs to be excavated, but once in a while, when small projects are done in this area, we uncover headstones, and this picture is from last year. We work closely with Rabbi Kolesnik and Ivano-Frankivsk when this happens. Also roads and streets, private gardens. If Jews lived there for 350 years, you can imagine, and the old cemetery closed because it was full in the 1920s, and they opened a new cemetery. By my calculation, somewhere in the roads and streets of Roharyn are about 10,000 Jewish headstones, and most of them we're finding are in fragment sizes because it's a nice building material size. We also have 2 wartime mass graves. They were the subject of non-invasive archaeological survey work, not this summer, but the summer before, which we funded in order to determine the extent and boundaries. And one of the major projects for 2019 is to better protect these sites, because we have an ongoing looting problem, which is a problem that is relatively common in Eastern Galicia. It's not necessarily that they are looking for buried gold. Roharyn was also the front in World War I, and there's quite a black market for military items, bullet casings, and other things that are of the military type. So a big project we want to work on next year is getting the sites better protected. I would say that the locals, for the most part, are aware. First of all, they're all aware that these sites are mass grave sites, and they do not, they respect the sites. The first site that you saw from the 42 mass execution is in a very rural part of the city, and there are fields around it that are regularly cultivated and plowed, and they do not touch the site. So it's a combination of being religious and also respectful. One of the things we are trying to do, of course it's just the 2 of us, but I do involve Jewish heritage, Jewish descendants, and we try and care for the sites to the extent that we can. We had wonderful help this year from the American Peace Corps organization stationed in Ukraine, and Facebook turned out to be a wonderful opportunity to get volunteers to come out. I would note that Roharyn is very, very typical, and I want to emphasize that we're talking the Holocaust by bullets here. For the most part, the Jews of Roharyn were not deported to camps, and so the numbers of these mass graves range from 3,000 to 3,500 for both sites. We're also involved and have been since 2011 with Yahad and Unum to take testimonies of Ukrainians who remember the Jewish community, and our website, which I will throw up on the last site, has their testimonies up both in Ukrainian and some of them now in English. I've done the English summaries of all the testimonies, but to get English translations from the Ukrainian transcripts, we're still working on that. Also, we have local support as well. This man here, prior to my arrival 10 years ago, was himself caring for the Jewish sites. Today he's 85 and not able to do that, and he was the first person I met when I went to Roharyn, and his first question to me was, what do you want to do now? And I, of course, had no idea what he was talking about, but I was the first Jewish visitor to come back in a decade, and he assumed I would now take over. And fortunately, he's very well respected in town. He's a retired teacher, which is a common characteristic. There's almost always somebody in town who's interested, and they're often teachers. And there's a new museum in town as well, and the public library has also been very supportive of our work, and this museum opened last month, and we, meaning my husband and I, contributed some information so they could create these panels, and we obtained a few artifacts typical of Jewish life, so I'm hoping the museum becomes the first stop that visitors would make when they come to town, because it's quite difficult to otherwise find the heritage sites. And now I would like to shine a light on the others. There are many, many young Ukrainians who, in their small villages and towns, have been mapping, interviewing, caring for heritage sites, and they don't even have a clue how to contact Jewish descendants. And one of the roles I have found myself in, especially in the last 2 years since I've been in Lviv, is to try and shine a light on these people on social media. So if Jewish descendants are coming to visit, they will contact them, get a tour, and maybe, hopefully, become long-term partners. Here is an example, as it says in Rudki. Radechiv, this young woman has been, this is inside the synagogue. She's very interested in doing something with the synagogue. She's actually running for office right now. And if she gets elected, she would really be in a position to try and push something forward. But I knew her when she was collecting Jewish headstones and returning them not to the Jewish cemetery, which has been completely destroyed and built over, but the Christian cemetery, because it's fenced and it's protected, and she'd like to do something with them. I think the slides speak for themselves. Most of these people you're looking at here are not Jewish. They are projects that I have volunteered on, and some of them are Lviv-based, such as the Lviv Volunteer Center. The Bromel project is quite interesting because that does have the involvement of American Jewish descendant. And if you're on Facebook and you know Arthur Kurzweil, you know he has lectured and written a couple of books. And he was just, I saw this morning, 10 days ago in Bromel, and awarded from the city a key to the city. This is the most recent project, only about a month and a half ago. And again, because of Facebook and Peace Corps volunteers, we pulled a huge group together, and probably 100 people from the city of Kalush came out. Students, teachers, residents, and the city administration for Heritage Day. They cared in the morning at the Jewish cemetery, and then everybody went to the Ukrainian cemetery to work. This is near Drahovich, and those of you may recall that a few months ago the Drahovich Synagogue finally finished renovation and it was rededicated, and just prior to that rededication there was work that was done at the nearby mass graves in Borisov. This will be a big project in 2019, and already the Lviv Volunteer Center is putting together a work camp where people will actually work at the Jacob Gonzer Synagogue, helping them do repairs and reproduce architectural elements that are missing. And this was probably the biggest thing to hit Lviv this last summer, not far from my apartment on Barvanuk. It was a street that is documented having been paved with Jewish headstones, and when the city opened it to do some repair work, the headstones were uncovered, and this job was 5 days, and we only excavated 20% of the street. The headstones were taken to the Jewish cemetery, and a memorial will hopefully be built with them. And the only way to sustain the heritage is in partnerships with the local people, the local administration, and it's rewarding. It's a must, and I know for a lot of people one trip is enough, but I encourage you to make the trip, reconnect, meet the people, talk to students, especially the young people in towns. They're asking the hard questions. They want to know about the history of their towns. And that's it. That's the website. We pride ourselves on having it bilingual. It's in both Ukrainian and English, because we'd like it to be available as a resource to the teachers and students in Roharyn. And in a week or so, we will be putting up some new material that specifically deals with the Holocaust in Roharyn, but also the righteous. And we're seeking help in identifying the righteous, because in many cases we only have first names or descriptions of where they live. So that will hopefully be our next big project with the students and the teachers. Thank you.
Thank you, Marla. I'm sure there will be lots of questions afterwards, but now I would like to move over to Iryna. She's going to give us a slightly different angle on the developments taking place in Ukraine. On just a personal reflection from myself, being a Ukrainian, I visited Lviv many times, and for many, many years I was quite unaware just how multi-layered and complex the history of this city is. And there's, what you can see with the naked eye, it's, the stones cannot speak for themselves, as Iryna said last night. There's so much to learn there, and the city now is only just starting to come to terms with its very complex and tragic past, and in many ways exciting past as well, because it's a city of a great literary tradition and very diverse culture of different peoples who lived there. And I'm really looking forward to Iryna's presentation now, who will share some insights on that. Thank you.
I'll start with a few remarks. First of all, I would tell you that I'm a teacher of critical and creative thinking at the university. And quite early on, I understood that formulating good questions is more important than finding the right answers or the possible many answers to them. So I started to practice with my students such tests when they have not to answer the questions, but actually to formulate them. And I have started that because I myself was confronted with some questions to which I was unable to answer back in the year 2004-2005, when some very important people started to come to visit university, and they were posing some questions to me as a local intellectual. So today I will try to somehow expand the frame a little bit from what Marla was saying. And I think I'm coming from this part which is in the humanities and which insists that unfortunately stones don't tell the stories, and human creatures are storytellers. Until we start talking, nothing actually is happening. So my talk is entitled Landscapes of Guilt and Landscapes of Rescue. It is a long dispute whether people can have roots, whether they belong at least somehow to the places they inhabit, whether there is something you could not translate from one landscape into another, like from one language to other one, some local context. Particularly in this century supported with cybernetic technologies, threatened by real wars and ecological nightmares, in the one global acumen of multiple connections, human beings are more nomadic than ever. We face transnational culture of emotions, tastes, sounds, and images, but does the local crumble? Is local and global a clear-cut distinction, or is it a blur? A new way to point out that local each time extends, and global each time takes place. And the place itself is dynamic, with no fixed coordinates. It is through encounters that one sees the landscape, beginning to navigate it, narrate it, conceive it, compare, and then go over. As much as histories are intertwining, the territories are overlapping. The city I come from, the medieval city of Lviv, was founded on the navigable Poltva River, but now it's dark, rushing, hidden creek, since late 19th century, cobbled with stones and included into the underground sewing system. The king who founded the city once lived in a castle on the top of the hill, the highest hill on this meridian as it extends from the North Pole down to the Black Sea. But in the Austrian times, the remains of the castle were demolished. Only the name endured, the High Castle Hill. The city was a rather confusing topography, and many enigmas has been hidden there. They were subject of rift, rupture, and violent switch from one power to another throughout the 20th century. In local juxtaposition, the same space was contested by three groups, each basically considering itself more than a minority, but in fact being less than a majority. Each group cherished a different sense of belonging and a different political fantasy to be implemented at the expense of its close neighbors. Even before the World War, this became an issue in international diplomacy, and then enabled that every new center of control found some fraction of population loyal to the enrolling regime, while some others antagonistic to it. Their pictures of the future overlapped in a big portion: modernization, emancipation, new genre de vie, and triumph of justice, with one ominous difference from the status quo, which is worth noticing. The future in each national version was imagined as homogeneous in its culture. The post-World War Polish state, just resurrected, was accredited by Entente to administer Eastern Galicia until upcoming national plebiscite, which actually never happened. The distinction came after Polish-Ukrainian wars for independence in 1918-1920, in which Jews were themselves threatened by pogroms and penalties for neutrality. Not only Eastern Galicia, but the whole land band Kresy, Western Bielorussia, Southern Lithuania, and Volhynia boycotted first Polish elections and continued turbulently. The government responded with nationalization and pacification policies. Any mixed reference of origin fall under pressure of a clear-cut choice. Roman Catholic Pole was sustained as a winning identity when the others has failed. Emancipated Cosmo-Polish Jews were entering ever darker times. Discrimination practice started with new dismissal of Jewish and Ukrainian civil employees tenured at the twilight of Habsburgs, and went further into reckless Polonization, fiscal policies, and educational quotas targeted against minorities. Assassinations of Polish top officials happened in response. Economy has been gripped by crisis, deepened by Great Depression. From mid-1930s, Poland went openly far-right, and Jews, especially religiously Orthodox and Yiddish-speaking, were pushed to mass immigration to Palestine. Jewish-Ukrainian relations also deteriorated. Clandestine terrorist organization of Ukrainian nationalists, OUN, within less than a decade made its way from a radical margin to the template core of Ukrainian political life in Galicia. Bonds of solidarity other than nationals shorn off. As the future approached, diverse indwellers educated by wars and modern militant ideologies soon found themselves being both objects and subjects of spiral violence. Community for which such a legacy may matter is a community without unity, varied and globally dispersed. Ukraine's recent traumas of a new war, with an allusion to Jan Tomasz Gross' Microhistory of Neighbors, 2001, and latest discussions on pogroms in Galicia in June-July 1941 and on 1943 Volhynia massacre, provoke gloomy associations. It suggests being a closely threatening neighbor across the imaginary Schengen border and across the real barbed wire of the human-proof fence an upgraded version of the rusted curtain. The mournful biographical heritage of this non-communal community is still mostly detached from its whereabouts. What one can see over the fence are thrilling geographical references to catastrophe along the ridge dotted by Soviet gulags and the northeast and Nazi camps to the southwest. Gross is saying that it was the irony of Jewish fate that being subject to Soviet repressions had saved many Jews from death at the hands of the Nazis. The irony, though, has not worked out for the vast majority. So place names like Babi Yar or Janovska accumulate a transnational fright far beyond their original eminence. But the whole territory, with its frightening hieroglyphics of space, was encrypted and insulated on the Soviet side under conditions when not only local archives, but places themselves closed to genealogical pilgrims or researchers. With the causes of the past not removed, half-century of inaccessibility finished them into the vigilant memoryscapes per se. Memoryscape is not a collective hallucination or a series of spatial images. However, it's not a tangible landscape and living space either. To be any useful, the word requires more specific designation. It involves retroactive framing of a topos of memory event. Conversely, each new spatial image endorsed to collective recall can change the acts of memory, bringing some fundamental alteration in making sense of place. This alteration is happening when remote names and scapes are put together with the original scene. But memoryscape tagged in the real space is not there. It remains a personal connection, even though not direct. Yet prosthetic or inherited, it accumulates human thoughts as felt and feelings as sought. Particular memories and testimonies regenerate an extra space which they try to insert into pre-existing landscape and social context of retelling. These extra spaces of concern may be movable, brought back to the actual locality and taken away from there. It's not a memory fixed to the place or the trace, but rather a place fixed to one's memory. Memoryscape is often a narrative form of lure connected to nostalgia. So when it comes to parallels memory, such a conflation of memory and place makes it an uncanny dwelling. Landscape, once being a project for living, work, love, and prey, becomes an actuality of mass grave. The neglected memory, the half-remembrance, can develop the opposite direction, get fuller oblivion or fuller recall. The first option, effortless and inertial, can be the prospect for the non-multimedial society, preposterously blocked from within and without. As my country, Ukraine, becomes more globally oriented, the first scenario seems not likely to happen. However, there is no other community of memory available at hand. The existing society, as complex and oblivious as it is the one who faced the moral task and task to adopt the current landscape of Jewish memory and to authorize it on the all-Ukrainian scale. Memoryscape answers the question on the critical where the local is localized. If Auschwitz is an early place metaphor for the Holocaust, then is it to be traced only in Oswiecim? And if 5/6 of the Holocaust happened elsewhere, what are the terrorscapes proximate to Auschwitz? And as 8 million non-Jews were murdered between 1933 and 1944 on the same terrains where the Holocaust took place, where is the burial ground of this memory? Who marks or policies the perimeter of it in public recall? Why not only memory of this tragic death, but also memory of Jewish life is neglected? One of the ostensible contradictions in such a place memory may well be found between city home and hostile place, as the sign of home is forever reversed. What was once domicile ceased to exist. What was once community has been destroyed. Relatives and friends perished or betrayed and then perished, and aside of all the former blissful messages the place was loaded with, it turns into unbearable one. The discourse on the Holocaust is entering Lviv through textbooks of world history, so that its spatial cover long remained foreign. Nothing can be less accurate and truer to the experience at the same time, since local population of Lvivians has been destroyed in more than 90% by the end of the 1945. So the nowadays Ukrainian city dwellers until recently never located this foreign trauma at home, hardly thinking about Jewish tragedy in the idiom of family neighborhood, which might ease to personalize and outcrop across significant differences, national difference or much more complicated difference among the descendants of victims, perpetrators, bystanders. By now, apparently, you've got an idea that the emergence of a shared memoryscape in the middle of Jewish and Ukrainian Geschichtsarbeitung will need continual remediation and reconciling. And there is no fence to sit on. Both tragic memories go global, and if they stick to the self-affirmative national imaginary of each, start to resemble rather the drift of aquariums in the ocean. But the free flow of goods and information also implies the free flow of emotions, both good and evil ones. I turn now to my examples intended to create a witnessing relationship to the Holocaust which took place and to exact this place decades after. Capturing the void, to some degree, they gravitate towards each other. First is the story of one tenement house in the north downtown of Lviv, of a dozen of families, all tenants of the Jewish householder Vesta Weissman, Starks, Blazers, Wallachs, Nakonechnes, Teves, Żelaznes, Schneebaums, Matiev, Mormurek, Szczur, and newcomer, young couple from the Soviet Ukraine, unmentioned by their surnames since the war break-up of Hitler-Stalin Europe in September 1939, till the last Shoah shootings and tracking in the fall 1943. A delayed memoir of Ukrainian neighbor. His personal story about the catastrophe Nakonechny is writing as a falling Soviet terror victim and a surrogate victim of Holodomor. Apart from the fact that there was no big hunger in Galicia, its memory became a black wound of identity for Galician Ukrainians since 1933. Moreover, he believes that Shoah can be told only in the broader context of the both Soviet and Nazi terror, in politics and ethics alike. In his modest contribution to the living in truth, he tries to tell what happened back then and does so coming up with a narrative about peril of the near and very real ones, like his best friend from the cradle, Yosale Wallach, and his first love, Asia Wallach. His connection with them is strong. He attempts to utter the long untold, one version of the story that the contemporary Ukrainians themselves have yet to confront. And he doesn't rely on simple binaries stuck between perpetrators and victims, though the text leaves you with the problem of more elaborated distinction. In this two-thirds of the story, he comes to a punctum, a direct death talk in the reality of mass killings and one's own fatality. When Asia Wallach, at that moment 11, escaped shootings in Yanovska street camp in Lysynachi ravine and made her way back to the ghetto, but listening to her testimony of last 3 days and nights spent in the offing execution, Yevhen is stricken to see that her eyes have grown old separately from her body, as if she has lived already all her life. Nakonechny is exact in mapping his memory in the downtown of Lviv. He gives street names mirrored with their nowadays headings, the exact numbers of the exact houses, the shops' interiors, the crossroads, the train stops, the yards with a through passage, the soundscape, the walking distance from A to B. He witnesses many adult decisions in the face of approaching terror, how to stay brave and perish, how to hide and still not survive. He guesstimates how helpful the underground Poltva channels might be if reinvented as a hiding place. It tells how Nazis before their retreat in 1944 were trying to cover up the killing sites by normalization into nature. He sees far too much, trying to be any useful and hardly finding any way out of the trap. He also understands that at this point he is in a privileged condition, as his death may occur by chance, while the fatality of his fellow Jews is scheduled. No help, no escape. If there is nothing to rescue, still memory speaks for it. The non-Jewish author's narrative put in place ethical grid onto which other Holocaust narratives told in Ukrainian and not can hold reconnection in located nature. The memory depends very much on the existing of local community of memory, and there was none, or almost none. Those Jews who were residents in Lviv in the Soviet time, mostly they were not local Jews. They came from other parts of the Soviet Union after the war. And they actually had very little knowledge. So they knew it was a Jewish city. But first of all, they mostly were not religious Jews. And second, they very often were not Yiddish or speaking or had very little knowledge of Hebrew. So they were Russian-speaking Jews, very often of different backgrounds, not necessarily from Russia, but of different backgrounds, and they inhabited parts of the city. They formed a kind of a community, but it was different, and it was very dangerous in a way to somehow address your or expose your Jewishness during the Soviet time. You probably know there were some waves of repression against that. So when in the early 1980s, under Andropov, there was a small opening that Soviet Jews had the chance to flee to the West through Austria to Israel, and very often through Israel to Canada and the United States and probably Great Britain. They actually left the city, and at the very end of the Soviet Union, another great portion of Jews left the city. So actually Lviv was having just very few Jews. And if you ask about history teachers, some of them may know something just from their places of origin. But it's also interesting that nobody was eager to compose the bigger picture. And very often these traumatic stories, they form something like a dark hole. It's not, we know that from many post-traumatic syndromes, that people could not get rid of these memories, but at the same time they don't know how to speak about them and they don't want to speak about them. So it's a very complicated story.
So thank you very much to our speakers, and thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Marina, for sharing so well.